All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Policy here at AASHTO. I want to welcome everybody to the 13th Asset Management webinar that we've had. These webinars have historically been sponsored by FHWA and AASHTO. The four, numbers 12, 13, and 14, and 15, are being sponsored in part with the Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group, and the TAM ETG was established by FHWA to sort of provide input and thoughts, guidance to FHWA on different activities that should be taking place related to asset management. Today's topic of the webinar is linking transportation asset management guidance to the planning process. These webinars, the webinar series has happened about every 2 months, going back to 2012 on a variety of topics. In the coming months, we're going to address a number of topics, including lessons learned from developing a transportation asset management plan, a second look at the transportation asset management financial plans. We had that webinar back in October of 2014, and it was very popular. For more information about these webinars, or to sort of take a look at the old ones in terms of the video recordings and to download the presentation material, you can go to tam.transportation.org and click on webinars. And that's where you'll find an archive of previous webinars with video, slides from previous webinars, the slides from today's webinar. I know that's one of the questions that we get quite often is, can I have the slides? So you can get those from the website. Again, tam.transportation.org and click on webinars. You can also link to this from FHWA's asset management page as well. And I also want to plug our LinkedIn group, simply called Transportation Asset Management. Again, it's a LinkedIn, so if you have a LinkedIn account, you can request to participate in that LinkedIn group. And Matt Haubrick from Iowa DOT set this up. And again, I encourage everybody to sort of join. It is right now limited to state DOTs as a way for state DOT folks to sort of talk amongst themselves. And we are considering opening it up to others as well from the research area, private sector, that sort of thing. Finally, if you have any questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please use the comment or questions functionality in the GoToWebinar service. The best way to do it is with the questions. We're going to take all the questions by, if you can type them in, we will then moderate those questions. We will verbally state them and then have the different presenters answer them. But that's the most efficient way to do it. In terms of phone logistics, this is a GoToWebinar service. Everybody is in a mute mode or a lecture mode, so we don't want to hear the beautiful on-hold music that sometimes occurs. So we have put everybody on mute. And with that, we'll have a brief welcome also from Steve Gay of FHWA before we turn it over to our facilitator, the facilitator today, who's Chris Avia, the director of the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve Gay of FHWA.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. I'm Steve Gay, and I'm the team leader for the asset management team in Federal Highway headquarters. Federal Highway, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, is proud to sponsor this webinar series with support from the Asset Management Expert Task Group in cooperation with AASHTO. It's kind of funny, going back quite a few years ago, one of the very first webinars that Federal Highway on Asset Management did in cooperation with the Subcommittee on Asset Management, it was led by Michigan DOT with Kirk Steidel in SEMCOG, the MPO.
Steve, you're cutting out a little bit there.
In Detroit. So there was, we all see the importance of planning and asset management. We've seen a couple of notice of proposed rulemakings out there. The asset management one is expected out shortly. But I think it's important when you think of asset management and you think of planning. I know some have said good asset management is good planning. So as you go through the webinars today, I think all the pieces will fit together rather well. Hey, let me turn it over to Chris Avila, Director of the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization, who's facilitating today's webinar. Chris?
Well, good afternoon, and for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. For the agenda today, just want to do a quick overview. We've heard from Matt and Steve already, and what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of what we hope you would be getting out of today's webinar. Give you a little bit of perspective on a real-life example that we're working on here in Waco and how that might tie in, and some policy implications that come from that. And then I'll be introducing our speakers before each presentation. But in brief, we have three lined up today. The first is Egan Smith from the Federal Highway Administration. The second presentation is from Tamara Haas from the New Mexico Department of Transportation. And our final presentation we'll be hearing from Steve Gunther from Caltrans. At the end, we'll bring Matt back and have an opportunity to address your questions and answers at the very end. Just as another reminder, Matt's already mentioned this, but if you have a question or a comment at any time during today's presentations, please use the Q&A feature that's on the webinar, and we'll try our best to get to those at the end of the presentations. So if we go on to the next slide here, today's presentations, we're going to be exploring transportation asset management, or TAM, in the context of the performance-based planning process, which is abbreviated as PBPP, and yes, that is a bit of a tongue twister. Our three presenters today will be addressing some of what we feel are some pretty important and timely topics. They include the basis of the TAM and performance-based planning process relationship. Hopefully you'll see some of the benefits that are achieved by linking together these two processes. And then the links between AASHTO's TAM guide and the guidebook that Federal Highways is putting together on the performance-based planning process. Together, today's presentations will also help provide a general introduction to performance-based planning process as targeted to the practitioners of asset management. As Matt previously mentioned, our purpose of our webinar series is to basically share the lessons that have been learned from those who are moving out ahead on these topics, sharing ideas not just among those who've already practiced these principles, but from those of you who are participating in today's webinar, and also to expand our knowledge base with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are to build a working knowledge of the relationship between TAM and performance-based planning, and beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer a couple of questions. First is, how can TAM help inform the performance-based planning process, and what benefits can agencies expect by strengthening the links between their TAM program and the planning process? So just further emphasis, we're here to share lessons learned, share ideas, and expand our knowledge. So with the next slide, I think most folks are aware that MAP 21 is going to require state DOTs, transit agencies, and MPOs to establish targets for several metrics associated with the transportation system. I've identified 4 here that are probably going to occupy the time for most of these agencies, but just recognize that depending on the complexity of the issues within your region or within your state, you may be required to address other metrics and establish targets for those as well. I wanted to bring up 2 important points here. First of all, state DOTs and transit agencies are going to be taking the lead on establishing targets once the rules are formally in place. And then MPOs are going to be looking at their regions and trying to identify what targets are reasonable for their areas. The important point here, though, is that the MPO targets are required to be consistent with what state DOTs and their transit agencies have already come up with. The next point is that the planning process is constrained to a realistic estimate of future revenues. We have to identify what we think will realistically be coming to our regions, or for that matter to a state, whether it's long-term for our long-range transportation plan, which covers 25 years in scope, or short-term for our transportation improvement programs, which cover the next 4 years. This forces a conversation between the policymakers that are establishing policy for our regions, and helps us identify what we can reasonably accomplish in those time frames, as well as what might be a reasonable target for the performance-based planning process. So with the next slide, what I wanted to do is just kind of go over a couple of other topics that hopefully show you the link between performance-based planning and TAM. The planning process reflects the goals, priorities, and what our communities feel the transportation system ought to be achieving moving forward into the future. And as such, the commitments that are being made as part of the TAM process or within our transportation improvement programs should be consistent with those priorities. But on the flip side of this, a robust TAM process can provide a lot of information to policymakers as they're weighing their targets or weighing the goals of their plans. It shows us the impact that their policy decisions may have on project schedules looking into the future, and give us some idea about what is a reasonable performance target for the future and whether we have a realistic opportunity to actually achieve those targets. And this is not an insignificant question because several metrics do have within the language some implications as far as future revenues, and if you don't make reasonable progress towards those targets, you may be forced to allocate some of your funding to specific activities, which you may actually have a preference to use in a different manner. So finally, the last slide here, I wanted to give you a little bit of an example of how this is kind of playing out in real time here in Waco. I'm actually processing an amendment to our transportation improvement program for a mobility project. We're basically converting a 4-lane arterial road to a full freeway section with frontage roads, overpasses at the main intersections, on-ramps, off-ramps. And as typical for a lot of our highway expansion projects, we don't have enough money in this fiscal year to actually move that project into a construction phase. We're close, however. Another $1 million and we're pretty much there, and so our policymakers along with our local TxDOT district have chosen to pull $1 million out of TxDOT's maintenance budget and apply that to this expansion project. The argument being that we are rehabbing the pavements, we are rehabbing the structures in this corridor, and the pavements and structures will be in a better condition once the project is complete than they are currently. But this brings up a couple of very important policy questions that we have to try to answer. The first of which is, would we be doing this rehab work in this corridor if we weren't already widening the roadway? If that answer is no, then what effect does this have on project schedules within our maintenance categories? Are we postponing work on facilities that may be in worse condition and may actually be in more dire need of some of these maintenance dollars? And then what is the impact to our ability to meet these future targets, whether it's for state of good repair or whether it's there's a benefit for us meeting our future safety or congestion targets? And are these trade-offs worth this transfer of dollars? And so moving forward into the future, these are some of the questions that we're going to be trying to address. So with that, what I'd like to do now is introduce our first presenter, who is Egan Smith from the Federal Highway Administration Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty. where he addresses FHWA's framework on performance-based planning process. Egan has over 2 decades of experience in transportation. He is a registered professional engineer and a professional traffic operations engineer. Egan is currently on Federal Highway's Planning, Oversight, and Stewardship team, and also provides overall support in the specific planning area of performance-based planning and programming. And so with that, I'll now turn it over to Egan.
Thank you, Chris. Good day, everyone. My presentation is going to highlight the relationship between transportation asset management and performance-based planning and programming. And I'll try to introduce a framework for performance-based planning and programming. It's a framework that can apply to all performance-based planning efforts. And the 2 guidebooks I'm going to reference during this presentation are based on good practices from the industry stakeholders, outlining the benefits that can really be achieved by tying performance-based planning and programming to asset management. Next slide. In a nutshell, adopting a performance-based planning and programming approach provides an opportunity to ensure that transportation investment decisions are made both on a long-term planning and a short-term programming of projects, but really based on the ability to meet the established goals that you identify in the planning process and in the multiple programming areas. So apart from asset management, some of the other program areas as well. So performance-based planning should really pull these program goals together, using not just the traditional plans, but really building off of these all other performance-based plans, such as the asset management plans and other key performance-based planning requirements. Next slide. To address the basic concept of performance-based planning and programming, Federal Highway, along with FTA and our stakeholder representatives, we put together a stakeholder committee about 2 years ago. And these are made up of folks from the state DOTs, MPOs, transit agencies, and the national associations to help guide us in the development of a guidebook that can address the issue of performance-based planning and programming. And this resulted in a guidebook designed to really highlight good practices and identify processes that could be very useful in addressing performance-based planning. And this guidebook specifically addressed what the key elements of performance-based planning and programming processes are, how they fit within the existing planning and programming process, and it also highlighted examples of effective practices. Next slide. The guidebook essentially presented these key elements. These key elements are not new, and they really build on the more traditional planning process and identifies the key performance measures to quantify objectives and identify targets to collaboratively work towards developing some sort of a measurable, predictable desired outcome. Next slide. Key outcome of the guidebook was the development of this framework to capture all the nuances of performance-based planning and programming. The framework you see here ties the key elements together and attempts to illustrate the cyclical nature of performance-based planning and programming. To step through the process, we start with the basic, oops, sorry, I think we lost the slide. To step through the process, we start with the basic characteristics of strategic direction, or simply put, where do you want to go? Analysis, or how are we going to get there? Programming, what will it take? And implementation and evaluation, how did we do? And you see that all of those steps are really interconnected. Under the strategic direction, you will have goals and maybe quantifiable objectives that guide decision making, and the performance measures that capture the goals and objectives. And the next, under analysis, targets can be set, though it's really important to recognize the challenge in defining meaningful targets in all areas and tracking progress over time, or performance monitoring and identifying the evaluating strategies that will guide the target setting. and the investment and policy decisions, you should start thinking about them as well, that you need to make as a transportation agency. And some of this more detailed information can come out of their other performance-based plans like the asset management plan and the safety plans as well. So making the link between planning and programming really requires, as you see from the step where you start to develop the investment priorities and you really look at developing an investment plan, really requires you to understand the set of actions and the strategies and investments that you can use to improve performance. And the expected impact of these strategies will have so that the resource-constrained, achievable collaborative targets can really be set. That's the way to really start setting your targets. So the planning process should really lead to the development of these investment priorities that can feed into an investment plan based on the resources that are available. This should lead to a program of projects that produces the outcomes desired. And one thing to consider as well, finally, is the successful process will require thinking about the implementation and reporting and monitoring that needs to occur after you get these programs out there, which not only feeds back into the planning process itself, but it also should feed back and inform the programming of projects as you move forward. Next slide. Ensuring the data agency's analysis really does inform investment is key. So I wanted to hit on that again. So you definitely really want to incorporate performance information, for example, into the STIPs and TIPs and other development processes. It's really critical to your performance-based planning and programming process. And the programming documents which identify specific programs or projects and strategies and funding sources should really link to the desired outcome that you have. And this can be achieved by developing a performance-based long-range transportation plan that really builds off of the goals and objectives and performance analysis of the other performance-based plans, like the asset management plan. So this is key to making that connection. Next slide. I just want to quickly highlight here, these are other performance-based plans that should inform the performance-based planning and programming process. As you see, we have the Transportation Asset Management Plan, of course, highlighted there. Therefore, coordination between the development of these performance-based plans and the long-range planning process should really be a major consideration to break down the silos and the communication throughout the planning process, not just when you're developing your goals and your objectives, but throughout the process when you're doing your analysis, etc. It should be communication between performance-based planning in terms of developing the long-range plan and these other performance-based plans as well. Next slide. The purpose of the model plan guidebook, this is the second reference document that I wanted to discuss. It was developed as a companion document to the performance-based planning and programming guidebook, and it's really to address developing a long-range plan that is performance-based. We have developed this as a companion, and it's titled Model Long-Range Transportation Plan, a Guide for Incorporating Performance-Based Planning, and using a similar group of stakeholder committee practitioners as we did with developing the first guidebook, folks from state DOTs, MPOs, transit agencies, and national associations. This guidebook was developed, and it's intended to provide some key information for developing a performance-based transportation plan. Next slide. This guidebook really identifies the key elements of performance-based plan, and it tries to align the model plan with the other performance-based plans and highlight some examples of effective practices throughout the industry. Next slide. The guide is structured around these key elements, and most of the elements of the performance-based plan as you can see here, are not new, but relate to common elements that are included in all long-range transportation plans. But the three items in bold are critical to making a transportation plan performance-based and may not have been present in past or existing transportation plans, but incorporating them now into the a performance-based plan really adds a lot of opportunities for you to really address the outcomes that you anticipate to come out of your planning process. And state DOTs, MPOs, and RTPOs should really put a particular focus on identification of performance measures and targets in their transportation plans, as this can really set them up to be able to develop a system performance report and really address a lot of the needs that are coming out of MAP 21 that compares the existing performance with previous developed targets and gives them an opportunity to really start setting targets that they can meet. Next slide. And to wrap things up, I'd like to close out with this slide. What this slide tries to do, it shows the relationship between the long-range transportation planning process, and there's a lot more details of this you can find in the guidebook that I indicated earlier, and other performance-based plans. You see the left column shows the elements of performance-based planning and programming as a framework flow, which aligns with all performance-based plans, really, including the long-range transportation plan and other performance-based plans, and provides an opportunity to really coordinate your efforts when developing these plans and provide detailed analysis from the right column where you see the other performance-based plans, and this can feed into the overall performance-based long-range plan development in the middle column. Which can utilize a lot of the detailed analysis that would be found in these performance-based plans like the Transportation Asset Management Plan, and feed that information, that more refined information, into the development processes and the analysis that you want to undertake when you're developing your long-range plan. And another thing I wanted to note here as well is we also indicated the CMP, and it is meant to be really a process that the TMAs over 200,000 required to do. And this process is supposed to be integrated with their planning process at the MPO. And if this has been successfully done, it can really provide the MPO an opportunity to really think about how they want to integrate some of the other information that's coming out in terms of performance-based planning. For example, like the information that would come from the state development of a transportation asset management plan. So that's a good opportunity to start having that coordinated discussion and see how some of the information that comes out of a transportation asset management plan can really be integrated into the development of performance-based plans throughout the state DOTs and the MPOs as well. Next slide. And I'll like to wrap it up there. I provided the links to the website, performance-based planning and programming website, where you can find these documents and a few others as well, and case studies and information that can give you a lot more details of this topic of performance-based planning and programming. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Egan. And just a reminder, if you do have a question or comment, please feel free to use the Q&A functionality on the webinar. You may post those at any time, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the 3 presentations. So with that, our next presentation is from Tammy Haas of the New Mexico Department of Transportation. Tammy is the Division Director for the Asset Management and Planning Division within the New Mexico DOT. The asset management role was created in April 2013 within the New Mexico DOT, at which time Tammy was appointed to this role. She has worked in transportation for 27 of the last 31 years. Prior to becoming the division director, Tammy was the District 3 engineer, where she oversaw all planning, design, construction, and maintenance operations for the Albuquerque metropolitan area. During her career, she has had several different roles with the New Mexico Department of Transportation, including Chief Engineer, and worked for the Federal Highway Administration prior to joining to the New Mexico DOT in 1995. And so with that, I will now turn it over to Tammy.
Thank you, Chris. My presentation is Performance-Based Planning and Transportation Asset Management Plan and how we're linking those together at NMDOT. Next slide, please. So we do have an agency strategic plan. Our vision, setting the standard for a safe and reliable and efficient transportation system, as well as our mission statement. Next slide covers the goals that we included in our plan. When we redid our strategic plan a couple of years ago, we centered on 4 primary goals. The first one of preserve and maintain the infrastructure, and this is where our asset management effort will fall. The other 3 goals are somewhat typical to most of the DOTs, and I'm not going to cover those in detail for this presentation. Next slide. So as far as the TAM implementation, where we're at is we really started this effort off in December of 2013 by conducting the self-assessment as part of the NHI course. We also had the NHI course with a core group of people that most of those people are now part of one of our working committees. Last year, when Federal Highway started their gap analysis effort, we were able to be one of the pilot states on that effort, and so we worked with AMAC and Cambridge Systematics to conduct our gap assessment. And through that effort, we did another self-assessment survey as well as face-to-face interviews with over 60 NMDOT staff. Cambridge Systematics presented an implementation plan to us, and during the tail end of the gap analysis is when we issued our RFP to hire a consultant to assist us with the development of our transportation asset management plan. We also have another contract to help us develop our statewide long-range plan. Our TAM contract effort primarily kicked off in the fall of 2014. SPICON Partners is doing our TAMP, and Cambridge Systematics is doing our statewide long-range plan, our affectionate acronym of SLRP for that. Next slide, please. So in our statewide long-range plan, we have a vision statement that somewhat mimics our vision statement for the agency as well as encompassing our mission statement. The vision in the long-range plan, this was agreed upon by a department coordinating committee, but with a lot of input from our stakeholders. So our next slide covers the goal framework in our statewide long-range plan. As we look at, there are 4 kind of key areas in that goal framework, and the top goal listed there is to preserve and maintain for the long term, which is our linkage to our transportation asset management plan effort. We had several different focus groups that were helping us work through the early stages of our statewide long-range plan to come up with these goals and to move us forward. As we go to the next slide, we identified the state highway network into some different corridors, and the committees and the working groups felt the need to stratify our corridors based on connectivity, travel demand, and type of route, as well as looking at the multimodal aspects of the contents for our long-range plan. Through this, we're going to look at defining minimum performance standards by tier as well as by mode. So as we go into the next slide, the Tier 1 corridors include our interstate and international connections. We do share a border with Mexico and a joint border with Texas there on the rest of New Mexico. So the big red line in the middle is Interstate 25, and actually it ties in with I-10. I-10 then continues on into Texas, and everything basically to the west side of I-25 is our international border with Mexico. So when you look at Tier 1, the interstates are transcontinental railroads as well as the Sunport, which is our airport in Albuquerque, somewhat unique with our naming convention. The next slide shows our Tier 2 road system. And the idea behind this was connecting our major cities with the higher amounts of travel, as well as some of our priority truck routes, and connecting to our major tourist destinations. The next slide shows our Tier 3 network. So this is connecting some of our other cities, travel demand of at least 5,000, and all of our remaining national highway system roadways. The next slide shows Tier 4, which is basically encompassing all of the other roadways in the state. New Mexico has a fair amount of roadways, but a very sparse population. The majority of the population in New Mexico is actually located in the Albuquerque metro area. I believe about 3/4 of our population is in Albuquerque. In order to use these tiers, when we go to the next slide, we're using the tiers as part of our alternatives for our statewide long-range plan. So when we look at the different alternatives that I'll briefly go over, we have our baseline revenue, and alternative A is basically continue our existing commitments to the extent possible. Alternate B is focus commitments on top-tier infrastructure. And then we also looked at a higher revenue, or more of our aspirational type of alternative, is to meet our regular commitments as well as achieve some of our strategic goals. We considered a low revenue option, but then we just decided that we weren't going to be able to achieve a lot with that, and we opted not to include the low revenue in our discussion of our statewide long-range plan. Next slide, please. So as just kind of a summary, alternative A is trends based on current practices. Alternative B is management plus a focused investment, and then alternative C is an aspirational vision and new revenues. So the next slide is a little bit more detail on our alternate A. So in here we have some priorities listed, and as I mentioned before, the consolidation of all of our different working groups for the statewide long-range plan came up with some of these priorities for us and to direct that. So as we look, and I have highlighted goal number 2 is the state of good repair. Continuing our current level of investment to preserve and maintain our highways and bridges in a state of good repair. The tiers are also described, Tier 1 through 4, of defining what a silver standard would be and what a bronze standard would be. Next slide. So when we looked at all of these options, I think one of the things that we considered that was going to be a constraint with alternative A is that we may see some deterioration in our overall performance due to declining purchase power of our revenues. We decided to put all of this information on one particular card, even though I have it separated out into a couple of pages, but just to kind of show the picture of each of these alternatives as a standalone, and how they will be utilized in the development of our asset management plan. Next slide. As we move into alternate B, the management plus a focused investment, the whole idea here is that as we improve our management practices, we'll be able to better prioritize our investments across our top tiers. Again, as we look at our priorities, our top priority that came about was always the safety and public health. But number 2 is the state of good repair, asset, and/or the asset management of maintaining our highways and bridges in a state of good repair, applying a proactive preservation first asset management strategy. New Mexico hasn't been too involved in the past in asset management to really have a concerted effort, and so as we're going through this effort, we are in the midst of the change. We are utilizing the TAM guideline as we kind of go through these different steps. Next slide, please. So as we look at the management and focused area, one of our supporting policies is that we are going to look at a life cycle cost basis. We're moving towards making our decisions and our expenditure decisions based on our long-term life cycle cost of building, operating, and maintaining assets over time. This is going to tie into our asset management plan, and as we link these two items together. Next slide, please. So alternative C is our aspirational vision and new revenues. In here, we don't really do a concerted effort on identifying the new revenues, but once again, as new revenues are developed, it'll help us to address our strategic priorities without having to let go of our current commitments. Once again, bullet number 2 here is our state of good repair. So as we look at those policies, this has been very important to everybody that participated in our statewide long-range plan effort. We will be defining what that state of good repair is. We haven't really set the bar on that definition yet as we look at our data, but we do recognize that we need to dedicate sufficient funds to achieve a silver standard in this situation, but until we actually put the pen to paper and figure out what those numbers are, we don't have that information yet, and that's one of the things we are working towards. So if we go to the next slide, once again, our supporting policy is the life cycle cost basis for this, and also we're assuming that we can have better management of our assets and operations, and then recognizing the demand and provide some budgetary flexibility to look at that demand and capacity improvement. Next slide. So as we're defining the scope of our asset management plan, like I mentioned, we just started out with our consultant in the fall, and our first cut at our transportation asset management plan is going to look primarily at our pavements and bridges as required by federal highways in MAP 21. We set up our decision-making processes with an executive steering committee. In New Mexico, we have a cabinet secretary and deputy cabinet secretaries, and that working group includes those people as well as our assistant division administrator with our Federal Highway Division office. We do have 2 division staff members on our executive steering committee. We also have a asset management working group. That's a larger group of the primary data asset owners. We also have district involvement on that working group, as well as our economists and our budget and our financing people from the agency to help us get to that asset management plan. One of the other things, big things that we've been really keyed on is doing a good assessment of the data that we have, as well as the infrastructure on what that data sets on, as well as what data elements we have. We're in the midst of revamping our pavement management system, and we are also just kicked off last week an upgrade or modification to our maintenance management system. Both of those are on the Agile Assets platform for those that may be interested. And we decided that our existing maintenance management system was not linked to our pavement management system, and that's one of the reasons that we're going for the upgrade, as well as our former maintenance management system basically is no longer supported. We're also looking at being able to upgrade some of our asset information into the new maintenance management system as we move forward. Will you go to the next slide, please? Our next slide, as we look at the guide, is following the steps, is aligning the organization. One of the things that happened is a team alignment or realignment, and our cabinet secretary just rolled out some modifications to the structure in January of this year. We've renamed to the Asset Management and Planning Division from Strategic Planning and Asset Management. We've consolidated our pavement management function and our pavement design function, and that group is responsible for our pavement management system, as well as all of our pavement designs on our projects. We also have a data management group that consists of roadway inventory data, crash data, and our traffic count data or traffic monitoring data. That group is also responsible for HPMS reporting. The GIS unit is also part of my division, as well as our maintenance management function and the maintenance management system. planning, research, and our performance management branch. So we felt that the realignment of our agency to put all these functions together will really help us as we integrate our statewide long-range plan and our asset management plan to work better together and have all of the functions under one key manager. The one piece that's missing with this is our bridge management function. That still resides with our bridge division, but they are part of our teams and working very closely with us. Because our bridge group serves multiple purposes, we opted not at this time to move bridge management under the asset management and planning division. We're also responsible for the data collection within my area. One of the big things we did in 2013 was to go out and we issued an RFP to go to an automated data collection for our pavement condition. With our first effort in 2013, we also collected LiDAR data so that we could pull off some of our asset data for other assets. One of the key things that we pulled off of that first cut was our sign inventory, but we haven't really tied that into our asset management plan at this point, just due to the data concerns and our funding constraints. Next slide, please. So this is another slide on our working group. So I kind of already touched on these two things as far as the ownership. You can read this information off the slide. And we'll move to the next slide. So as we're looking forward to the future, next week we have one of our first kickoffs of a data analysis workshop as part of our TAMP effort. We're also in the midst of taking our bridge and our pavement data and creating a model for that, because we can't use our pavement management system right now because it doesn't allow us to take our automated data into it. So we're in the midst of that reconfiguration. And then our bridge database that we've used, we haven't had any of the models in there. So we're looking at working with our consultant on developing some spreadsheet models to start doing some of those initial assessments of needs so that we can look at the bridge and the pavement separately to start making some of those investment choices. We are moving towards a preservation first mentality in the agency. So far, we've still been in the worst first type of scenario, but through our efforts and our meetings with our TAMP effort, we're getting that message out there. We're also talking about doing a life cycle cost analysis and looking at life cycle costs whenever we look at those investment decisions and future projects. And we are trying to move to a data-driven decision making. That's one of our goals that our Cabinet Secretary has firmly stated, as he wants us to be a data-driven decision-making organization. As we move forward and look at financial planning and investment analysis, that is one of those serious things, because you need all these pieces in order to put together a good financial plan. And of course, we all want to comply with the MAP 21 requirements, and just like every other DOT, we're desperately waiting for that notice of proposed rulemaking to come out. One of the other big things with the data-driven decision-making is we also want to have a self-service data portal. I guess when we grow up as a DOT, we want to kind of look like UDOT with what they have with UPlan, and so we're kind of starting at the very beginning and trying to build all these things and meet all of the federal requirements. With that, we can go to my last slide, which is basically my contact information. We're learning, we're researching, and glad we can participate in one of these webinars and provide where we're at with our efforts on asset management and how we're working on our long-range plan and trying to make sure these two items are in sync. And at least with that, they're all under the same manager, so I guess I better deliver on that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Tammy. Our final presentation today is from Steve Gunther of Caltrans, where he's going to provide an overview of Caltrans' pilot project, the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, otherwise known as SHOPP. Steve is a senior transportation engineer with Caltrans and has worked for Caltrans for 14 years, currently with the Office of Strategic Management. He has transportation experience in roadway design, bridge and roadway construction, traffic operations, and organizational, strategic, and performance management. Steve is the lead for Caltrans in developing and implementing a MAP 21 compliant TAMP, otherwise known as a Transportation Asset Management Plan. And with that, I will now turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Chris. So here at Caltrans, we've had a team working for about the past 6 months or so on what we're calling the SHOPP pilot project. And the goal of this project is to develop and test or pilot an improved methodology for an improved and transparent project selection process on our SHOPP projects. And again, the SHOPP is a State Highway Operation and Protection Program, and this is a $2.3 billion program that maintains and preserves the investment of the state highway system and its supporting infrastructure. Capital improvements programmed in the SHOPP are limited to maintenance, safety, rehabilitation of state highways and bridges, which do not add new traffic lanes to the system, so non-capacity improvements. So today's presentation will mainly focus on the factors leading up to the project and the process for the project itself, what we've gone through for this project. It's going to be very high level. I actually can't get into too much detail about some of the aspects of this project, as we're still developing a final report and still rolling it out to some of our internal staff and some of our external partners. So I guess today is kind of planting the seed and giving everyone kind of a taste of what we've been doing, but we've done some really neat things. But I can't show you everything, but maybe, you know, who knows, in a future webinar in a couple of months, I can come back and give you a much more detailed look at things. That would be great. Next slide, please. Okay, so what prompted this project? Well, I take it back about 2 years or so with MAP 21. Caltrans began what I call its current effort in asset management. An executive board committee on asset management was formed, and they began setting the vision for asset management. We developed a work plan for our TAMP and also established teams, teams for risk, teams for asset preservation, teams for financial analysis, that would begin looking at different aspects of our TAMP. And our original plan, and it still is our plan, is to include 4 assets, bridge and pavement as required by MAP 21, but we're also going to include culverts and ITS elements. So we were working along for a year or so on that, and in late 2013, our agency, Caltrans is a department under our agency, transportation agency. They hired a consultant, SSTI, State Smart Transportation Initiative, to do an internal review of our department processes and business practices. And after the report was produced with recommendations, the Caltrans Improvement Project was formed. These work groups were formed for the Caltrans Improvement Project. And one of the recommendations that came out of that report and the work groups was for an improved and transparent process for project selection. Currently, it's kind of a black box. We don't have a real transparent way of explaining how the projects are chosen, and it's in a nutshell, it's on a program-by-program basis. Each program, bridge, pavement, culverts, each choose their selection of projects, and then it kind of goes into the big pot, and everything gets funded. So we needed a more, it was requested, and we also wanted to provide a more holistic and explainable process. And so upon further recommendations by the committee and also new legislation that we have in California, which is known as Senate Bill 486, was signed by the governor last year, went into effect this year. We kind of shifted our focus internally over the past few months to look at an improved project selection process in the SHOPP. So we formed a team and began work. Next slide, please. And so the purpose of that pilot project, and I've already kind of alluded to it, is that we needed to enhance the accountability and enhance transparency, kind of pull everything out of those buckets and explain it in a more holistic and explainable process. The short-term goal is to evaluate the 2016 SHOPP projects against the department goals and objectives. And the long-term would be by 2020, the goal of the project is to include the PID development, our project initiation documents, into the department's mission, vision, and goals. So this process would be even back in the project initiation by 2020. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we did as a team was we started looking around at projects prioritization software, and really what's better known as decision analysis software. It's giving a set of criteria. The software is given a set of criteria, and then you input your projects, and based on your criteria and how it's rated, it's done in various different ways. But projects, you're given a project prioritization. What's the highest ranking to the lowest? And so we started looking at different software, and there's all sorts of software out there. There's everything from free, open source type stuff, to stuff that could be over $1 million a year for us. So one other thing we also recognized as we kind of started peeking under the hood of some of these different softwares is that there's different methodologies that these softwares use for decision making. So we realized, before we rush out and buy software and spend these taxpayers' dollars, we needed to do our due diligence and look at not only the tools, but what are the best decision-making methodologies for a transportation organization, especially one like ours responsible for 50,000 lane miles and 12,000 bridges. Next slide, please. And so as we started digging a little more, we find decision analysis is an entire field of study with countless papers and books written on the subject. It's really pretty impressive, actually, the amount of research and study that's done all the time on decision analysis. So we really wanted to look into this a little bit further and educate ourselves on what this methodology was. And then a tool could provide that visual interface. So if we could choose a methodology and then choose perhaps a tool that best met that methodology, then we can move forward. Next slide, please. So this is just I'm not going to go through each one of these. This is just going to give you an idea of what we were looking at when we first started looking into decision-making methods. There's a lot out there. There's the simple methods. There's weighted sum models, things like that, point allocation. But a lot of the software uses more complex methods like AHP, analytic hierarchy process, MAUT, so on and so forth. So like I said, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it's just kind of give you a sense of what we were looking at when we started looking into just different decision-making methodologies. And what we did realize is that with all of this out there, we kind of realized maybe we need some help. So next slide, please. We initially, one of the first things we did was decided we need to educate ourselves, and we realized we don't have the internal organizational expertise when it comes to decision methodologies and decision-making software and things like that. So we employed the services of a couple of different consultants. Dr. Ralph Keeney came in and did a one-day set of interviews with our executive management, and then he produced a report giving us some recommendations on how to move forward. And then Dr. Lee Merkhofer came in and did a workshop with what we call our core team, and then also some of our technical experts, subject matter experts that are in our shop. And so we had these consultants come in, kind of educate us, give us their findings, and make recommendations on methodologies for moving forward. And after we met with them, got the reports, we decided on what's called multi-objective decision analysis framework, and it's also called MODA. It was determined based on the recommendations that it's the best method for developing an explainable and goal, mission, vision-oriented framework for our organization. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a high-level 6 points, 6 major steps to developing a MODA framework that I've put together here. And the development of the framework is a very important part of the process because it supplies the logic that is behind all those pretty charts and graphs that you see in some of the tools. So we really wanted to make sure we worked through it diligently and had at least something that gave, the project prioritization and what comes out of it on the back end is only as good as the logic that's going into it. So we really wanted to take our time with this, and this was really the majority of what we spent our time on. And I'll just kind of run through these steps of objectives. First, developing your objectives hierarchy or your fundamental objectives. Fundamental objectives are end objectives as opposed to a means objective, and it's the end you are trying to achieve. And I'll show you in the next slide, but each of our fundamental objectives are tied to the goals and ultimately the mission and vision. So for something like safety, you keep it concise and you keep it either you're trying to maximize or minimize something. You're trying to minimize fatalities and injuries. So it's not to be confused with like a means objective would be to increase seatbelt usage. Well, why do you want to increase seatbelt usage? But really, you're trying to minimize fatalities, and so you're trying to get to that end objective. Once you establish the objectives hierarchy, your fundamental objectives, then you can start looking at the value functions. And then this kind of ties to the data also. The data compilation is what data do you have that can feed a value function that it will assign a value to that particular objective, and which will ultimately roll up and give a value to the project, and then rank it accordingly. So we worked through the value functions and the data compilation, and then really the scoring is what comes out of those value functions. There's a weighting system we used. There's many different ways we could have done this. We just did it kind of arbitrarily as a team, but ultimately as an organization we would probably want to use something a little more maybe like by committee or individual. One method we have been trying to use and been kind of playing around with is this method called swing weighting. And instead of looking at regular weighting as kind of it's the relative importance of a weight, one thing opposed to another, safety as opposed to maybe mobility, which should get a higher weight. I'm sure most people would say safety, but in swing weighting, you're really looking at the variability of the data. It's how much variability there is in the data that's available, and so it gives us how much swing does that have, and so that's how it's weighted accordingly. It's a more quantitative assessment. And speaking of quantitative, I should back up, just mention one thing. As far as our data that was used for this project, we wanted to keep it purely quantitative. We didn't want any qualitative assessments of the projects. That could come at a later point, but for the purposes of this and the time constraints that we were given, we had to use purely data that was available and keep it purely quantitative and not qualitative. The last point there is a sensitivity analysis. So once you've got your score and your project prioritization rankings, you can start messing around with the weights if you want and see how priorities change as weights are adjusted. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So I mentioned that this is what I was mentioning earlier as far as the objectives tying to the goals and mission vision. I know you can't read this. This is, in essence, our objectives hierarchy. I'll start from right to left. You can see the data sources feed into the value functions, and those value functions give value to each of those objectives. Like I said, minimizing fatalities and injuries, things like that. And then those are tied to, there should really be kind of a cutoff. It's just to show that there's a link, an explainable process of how we're valuing those projects. They're valued by the goals and the mission vision of the department. And so, like I said, I know you can't read that, but it's just to give you an idea of the big picture of what we were trying to achieve with this process, this MOTA process. So kind of where we're at now, and this is where I'm going to have to kind of cut it off, but we're doing some of that sensitivity analysis. We're still working through some of the adjusting some of the value functions and looking at potential value data sources, things like that. We've implemented or put this objectives hierarchy into an Excel spreadsheet and have been able to demonstrate the functionality of this. So we've been able to look at the sensitivity. We've been able to look at what's the optimum value for a project portfolio given different weights and different values and things like that. We've also been able to look at different funding scenarios. How does the value of a portfolio change based on 10% more or less funding, things like that. And then also we've been able to compare to our existing process. currently these programs that are within our SHOPP have a priority ranking, so we've been able to compare our value versus the priority ranking and how those projects would or are funded in 2014 as opposed to how it could be done with our system. There's been some limitations, obviously, with some of the data and things like that. We've had to make some stretches on certain things, things like greenhouse gas reduction. We've looked at utilizing IRI improvement. There's some studies out there showing how improving IRI can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we've had to kind of make some stretches with certain things. But hopefully, like I said, this is really just a test, proof of concept and a functionality. And this will continue to evolve, and it's really so that we can put together, next slide please, so that we can put together a final report, and we're targeting the end of next month, and we'll have some recommendations for moving forward, what some of those improvements and data sources, things like that, need to be done. And then we're also going to do a research project through our research division. This will be a more long-term, in-depth analysis, which will be done. Usually they're done through a UC, University of California type of contract, a research contract with them. So that's another project that will come out of this effort that we've done here at Caltrans. Again, I know I've gone through this fairly high level and brief, and it'd be great to come back in the future and show you more. But that's where I'm going to have to cut it off. So next slide, and turn it back to Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Steve. This is Perry Lubin from Spy Pine Partners. I'm stepping in for Matt Hardy. And that'll conclude our presentations for today. So big thanks to all of our presenters, to Chris for moderating, and we can open it up now for Q&A. If you have a question, just please type it into the Q&A box in the webinar toolbar, and we'll take them in order as you type them. Looks like we have a couple of questions for you, Tammy. So the first is from Richard Dunn, and he asks, how is silver standard defined by New Mexico DOT?
As far as we haven't really got through those final definitions on all of that, we're still developing that as part of our statewide long-range plan effort.
Okay.
And we'll be using our data to determine where we set those bars, and we're waiting on our consultant to give us the first cut of our pavement and our bridge models to start defining those areas.
All right. Richard has two follow-up questions for you. He asks whether New Mexico DOT utilizes AASHTO bridge management, which was Pontus until recently. And he also asks, how is New Mexico DOT addressing the risk-based focus of the MAP 21 requirement?
Yes, we are using Pontus for our bridge. We don't have the modeling piece that was in the last version, and so we're getting ready to move into the new AASHTO on the bridge. As far as our risk-based, we will be considering that in the development of that, and I believe it's in the March-April timeframe when we're going to be having our first workshop on our risk-based feature of that. We haven't, it's included in our contract for our consultant to develop that piece, but we haven't got to that point yet. So it's one of those to be coming in the future items.
Thanks, Tammy. And it looks like the next question, Tammy, is for you as well. It's from Richard Strong, and he asks, how many employees in New Mexico DOT's newly aligned division? Are they all central office or a combination of central and field or district?
In the new aligned office under my area, there are a total of, I want to say 68 of us, and we are all located at the general office. Within the planning division, we have two of our planners, one that primarily focuses on our international border and then a planner that are located in Las Cruces to the south. But essentially all of the staff for asset management and planning are located in Santa Fe in our general office.
All right, and Tammy, there's one more question from William Strong for you, and he asks, how often will decision-making teams meet, executive and TAM working groups?
Right now, as we're working through our contract, we have a monthly meeting for both our executive steering committee and our working group as we're working through the initial stages of it. And I think once we get to implementation, then we'll decide at how often those meetings will occur after that point in time.
Thanks, Tammy. So the next question is in the form of a comment from Robert Ham, and he says, for the upcoming rulemaking, the notice of proposed rulemaking suggests that if a 10th mile section is missing, it be rated as poor, and he just notes this relates to the automation of data collection and asks if there's any comments about automated data collection, and I guess with respect to the missing 10th mile data or sections from any of the state DOTs.
I guess I'll take that one first. What we've been looking at with our data is the old way when we collected it manually, all we were getting was the first 10th of every mile, and we weren't collecting in the urban areas due to safety. Now with our automated data collection, they are basically running continuous. If there are gaps or missing pieces in that don't have an explanation as far as new construction or an existing construction project, we will assume conditions on either side to fill in that gap if it's kind of a short gap. But right now, with the way they collect, they're taking measurements basically every 26 feet, so we shouldn't be missing too much data.
Thanks, Tammy. And Steve, do you have anything you would like to add?
Unfortunately, no. I know we do have a new pavement management system, PAVM, and it's being implemented, and it's definitely an improvement over the old process. I would have to defer to our pavement folks or pavement engineers on how they're handling missing data. I don't have an answer for that. Sorry.
Oh, thanks, Steve. We have the next question is for you, Tammy. It's from Thor Steffen. He asks, how is pavement being evaluated in New Mexico? He says he recently saw a webinar suggesting that only good would be considered okay. I guess it looks like good in the good, fair, poor spectrum.
As far as our evaluation with the data, that's one of our biggest concerns is our pavement management system. When we reconfigured it 2 years ago, it was to accept our manual method of data collection, which was basically putting all of our pavement condition into 3 buckets, high, medium, and low as far as distresses and things like that. And now that we're getting the automated data, it's pretty much, going from 0 to 100, so we had to reconfigure that section. So we haven't completely defined how we're going to set those parameters, and that's what we're working with our consultant on, is as we look at the data outside of our pavement management system, where do we set those thresholds, and where do we put that definition of good? We haven't figured out what good means to us and what type of work we would do to a pavement that's classified that way.
Thanks, Tammy. So our next question is a comment as well from Francine Shaw Whitson, and I think this could be one that either Egan or Chris could address. It says MAP 21 does not require that MPO targets be consistent with state DOT's targets. and she just wanted to clarify that point. And I don't know whether that's something that you'd want to pick up on, Egan.
No, she's correct. That's Francine Shaw. She's out of the TPM office. She's actually the lead on the MAP 21
yes.
issues.
Right. Okay. I think that oh, we've just gotten one more question. It's from Richard Dunn. It's for you, Tammy. He asks, in New Mexico, how does New Mexico DOT deal with Indian reservation roads and bridges? Are they a separate tier? And he just notes that in California, and he also asks, in California, how is Caltrans dealing with independent transportation authorities like Sandag? So the second part for Steve there.
I'll take the first part. As far as the Indian reservation roads, we have 23 pueblos, tribes, and nations in New Mexico. The majority of the roads that are on the national highway system are DOT maintained. They may show up on the IRR inventory. I know the Navajo Nation wanted to include 491 on their inventory. I think that was more a ploy to get additional funds rather than to do any maintenance on it. But the DOT is basically responsible for the majority of the NHS. Most of the other NHS that got out of the principal arterials are local roads, and I don't believe that we had any tribal roads that made the NHS cut. If it was a state-maintained road, we collected the data. If there happened to be an HPMS section on an Indian reservation road, we would have collected the pavement condition data for HPMS reporting. But as far as going any further than that, we haven't addressed those systems yet.
Thanks, Tammy. And Steve, I'll just read the second part again. Richard asks, in California, how is Caltrans dealing with independent transportation authorities like Sandag?
As far as dealing with, I'm assuming in regards to MAP 21 requirements and how are we coordinating with the locals and the MPOs and RTPAs and so on and so forth. We've had some initial outreach and had some brought them together in a couple of different forums to start engaging that process. As far as the data collection in the locals, on the local system, the local NHS, we have had over 5,000 lane miles added to the NHS on the local system, and Caltrans is going to collect that the payment data ourselves. So we have a contract underway that's going to actually just collect it ourselves.
Thanks, Steve. And unless there are any other questions coming in the next minute, I just want to say thank you again to all of our presenters and to Chris for moderating. And this concludes today's webinar. So the next webinar on our schedule is Lessons Learned from Developing a Transportation Asset Management Plan. It's going to be held Wednesday, April 8th. And then one last reminder, just today's webinar, all the webinars in the series, they're all available online at tam.transportation.org. Go to the tam.transportation.org site and click webinars in the menu on the left-hand side of the page, and you can find slides and video of the entire series. So I hope you'll continue to connect with us there. And thanks very much, everybody.